This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Welcome to this MENA Talks podcast, Season 2 of the Brussels International Centre. My name is Ben Lowings. I'm a political analyst at the BIC. And today I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Daniel Fiott, who is head of the Defence and Statecraft Programme at the CSDS at the Brussels School of Governance, as well as non-resident fellow at the Real Elcano in Spain. One of the cornerstones of the European Union is its foreign policy. And given the state of the world in 2022, it is not hard to see why. War has returned to Europe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Tensions between the global superpowers of the United States and China are at a high level. Violence has continued at Europe's southern borders in Libya and Syria. And meanwhile, the threats presented by terrorism and the like continue to be high. This brings us to the EU's main foreign policy approach, the Common Security Defence Policy. The CSDP is specifically designed to both promote and preserve peace, and it does this through both civilian and military means. This is what it calls an integrated, comprehensive approach. Daniel, can you expand a little on what the CSDP broadly is and what operations and actions are currently happening through it as of November 2022?
Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks for having me on. I think what you said in your introduction was a pretty neat way of saying it, which is that CSDP essentially refers to the EU's civilian and military missions and operations that it deploys around the world. And it's very important, I think, politically to keep in mind that CSDP, as one among many acronyms that the EU has in this domain, is actually or should be actually seen as a kind of subset of its more general foreign policy. So a bit unlike, I guess, what we see in the case of NATO, which is kind of strict and straight military alliance. What the EU has done with CSDP is basically make it a subset of its general foreign policy. And hence, when you said in your introduction, or the reference to comprehensive or integrated approach, that really feeds into that kind of logic that it's not just about military means, but it's about how you apply military and civilian means to foreign policy, right? So we've got to see it as a kind of subset of the general policy. And the best way of seeing that, even politically, is if you just look at the fact that we have a fully fledged Foreign Affairs Council made up of foreign affairs ministers, but we only have an informal defense council. So it's also kind of subordinate to that. So even politically, I think the EU has always put CSDP as a part of its general foreign and diplomatic approach. In practice, what that means and what it has meant for the last 2 decades or so is the deployment of civilian and military missions and operations. And for the military side, that's pretty clear. That's either naval operations, such as in the Mediterranean or off the Horn of Africa. It can also be training missions. So most recently, there was one in Mali. There's one that's been recently set up in Mozambique. And even recently, much more recently, in fact, in the last day or two of the recording of this podcast, the decision to set up a training mission in Europe for Ukraine's armed forces as well. Also, in the military side of things, it's been done in the past, not so much today. It's also the deployment of military rapid reaction forces to deal with a particular crisis. It was not so long ago in 2008, for example, where we deployed force in Chad. On the civilian side, so not military, but civilian side, that sees the deployment of individuals such as police officers, judicial experts, security sector reform experts who are deployed in country and can work very much with the authorities of that country, them with assistance, also building their own capacity. So it's a blend and a mixture. And in many places, geographically speaking, you see the deployment of both civilian and military. So it really speaks to, I guess, more the comprehensive approach, which is civ-mil integration. And that fits in with the broader integrated approach, which then layers on top diplomatic efforts, development aid, financial assistance, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a great introduction to the CSDP. But let's return to the general purpose of the policy in general, because on a purely existential level, I mean, a common question, I guess, is what is the point of an autonomous EU foreign policy when we have NATO here? on the continent, for example. For the transatlantic alliance, we've seen it seems to have a renewed sense of importance this year. Finland and Sweden have applied to join. And a lot of people will say that NATO is the real guarantor of European security. So in that sense, what purpose does the CSDP have and what role does it play that NATO does not? And further, is there a tension between the two in any way, be it political or in practice?
And not to kind of bore your listeners with a long history lecture, but I think the fact that we speak about CSDP or EU defense anyway relates to, I think, the experiences of the Balkans and the breakup of former Yugoslavia, where it was even, led by significant member states, in particular France and also the UK at the time, who decided that the EU did need to have an autonomous capacity for action. Now, there were varied reasons for that, not least the fact that the Americans themselves had made it clear that, this was yet another occasion in which they had to come in and mop up Europe's mess, so to speak. And some politicians, probably quite presciently, I would say, assessed that this couldn't be a sustainable kind of setup with the US, and that at some point the Europeans would have to get their act together. Pretty much the discussions we're having today, by the way, with the US shift to the Indo-Pacific and China. Again, the discussion becomes, well, what are you Europeans going to do more for your own security? And the two ways that we can do that are through the EU and through NATO. And I think it's important, firstly, to draw a distinction between the two organizations. NATO is very clearly a military alliance, and it's taking control and the lead when it comes to conventional defense and also nuclear deterrence as well. And those are two areas that the EU doesn't have a mandate for. I mean, even in the treaties, it's very clear that the EU does not have a mandate for the type of military tasks that NATO should undertake. On the other hand, NATO has certain limitations to what it can and cannot do. Right. So whereas it might be in the lead when it comes to conventional defense, nuclear deterrence, it suddenly then has a kind of gap or a gray area in joining the military instrument or in military dimensions of policy with broader economic, diplomatic and political policy. And that's where the EU then steps in, because the EU as an organization, in charge of the single market, managing different areas of security threats. That's where it then kind of meets with NATO. And so you've got a lot of EU member states who are also in NATO and vice versa. So that, of course, helps. Now, the general impression, of course, is that these two organizations are kind of set up for either duplication or kind of rivalry. And let's not shy away from that. I think in some cases that impression has been, at least on the institutional political level, there's certainly been kind of vanity, beauty contest elements going on. But I think also something has pretty much changed in about 2014, I would say. So once Russia seized Crimea illegally, what you saw from the leaders of both organizations is a pretty clear and quick recognition that if either organization tried to deal with the Russia crisis and Ukraine crisis on its own, it would fail. And the Kremlin in particular would be able to exploit the gaps or differences between the two organizations. So in order to not have any light or gaps in its approach, it worked much closely together. So it's no coincidence then that you start seeing the joint declaration between EU and NATO, and then you start seeing a lot more staff working level cooperation on lots of issues, and in particular on countering hybrid threats, which is one of those areas where EU and NATO can actually cooperate quite well together, I think, given the differences of tools that they have. And of course, it got very bumpy during the Trump administration. Not so easy to manage that. But in a funny kind of way, there was more emphasis on EU-NATO cooperation during that. And now, of course, with the current US administration, the conversation comes back again to what more Europeans can do. So I think governments themselves are are becoming a bit more agnostic. They're trying to find things in their institutional armories that just work, rather than engaging in a kind of beauty contest between the two organizations.
So at this point, I guess it's probably a good idea to look a little deeper at the current state of Europe in terms of its security outlook. Because as you rightly say, there is still this sense that NATO is the biggest deterrent in terms of towards threats. But there have been overtures by some very prominent European politicians, notably the High Representative Josep Borrell, about developing autonomous European military capacity and defence capacity. And it's within this context. I mean, this year, the EU published their strategic compass. They identified key threats, notably in the east, with direct reference to Russia, in the south, where it named both Libya and Syria, yes, as ongoing crises, but also other issues such as migration and terrorism. And then in addition to these broad regions, they identified the Arctic and growing threats there, and growing threats in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is notable because it is direct reference to Turkey and its issues with Greece and Cyprus. And then again, that brings the NATO issue back up, which we were just talking about. But regardless of that, would you say the EU is prepared for these threats? Because the High Representative, he said that member states needed to increase their financial investment in defense spending. And he also said that we need to increase things like military harmonization and synchronization. Now, those things are in terms of EU defense rather than NATO per se. So how is Europe doing right now with these sorts of issues?
Thanks. No, I mean, it's important to keep in mind that the strategic compass which you referred to, I mean, that document, which was endorsed by the heads of state and government, so at the highest level of political authority in the EU back in March of this year, that document is the first document of its kind. So if you ever want to try and find, I guess, what could be called as the white book, or the French would call it le livre blanc, the Weiss book in Germany, a document that basically summarizes and encapsulates what European defense means, you look at the strategic compass. So that's the first time it's been produced. And I think, even though it's a very long document, probably far too long, what's important about it is that it shows to the public, to those who are interested, what European defense means. Now, we've just spoken in the last few minutes about CSDP. So that's about the military and civilian operational dimension. What the compass does is go beyond that. So it also brings in to the discussion things like what the EU is doing in terms of its defense industrial policy. What the EU is doing in terms of helping member states develop together military capabilities, for example. So when the High Representative talks about the need for more money, I'm fully subscribed to that. Although I think he also goes on to say, and again, I would agree with this, that we already have a lot of money in the system to some degree. So it's also about how we use that money better. And I guess the easy way, or the easy answer to that, is to Europeanize as much as possible, so that you can not duplicate, you try and keep the costs low, and you can develop in common capabilities and tools that you need. The document goes in many different areas, by the way. I mean, it looks at maritime security, space security, air. I mean, it's very all-encompassing. Now, what you said in what your question really asked, and I think what is really important, is can the EU deal with all of the threats and demands that it's quite elegantly detailed in the compass? And I would say that the answer is no at the moment. So it's a very pessimistic reading, but I don't think anyone looking at this realistically and seriously would argue anything otherwise. So it's true now that many Europeans are improving their contributions within NATO. So the core task has to be defense and the defense of Europe. I think most governments are fully agreed with that. However, on the other hand, we've got to start thinking about threats and challenges as they emerge around the world. And of course, the Indo-Pacific is one area that definitely getting more attention, not just in the US, but also Europe. And what the compass, I think, tries to do, and this is where the level between expectation and reality is that it casts the EU as a global actor rather than just as a regional one. Right. So in a sense, you say, well, it's right and proper that the EU does see itself as a global actor, given the size of its economy, its global interests. But on the other hand, then you start to question, well, do you have the resources and capabilities to uphold such a role? It's very, very challenging. I mean, even in the case of when we talk about the EU deploying military and civilian missions and operations, that has become extraordinarily more difficult to do today than it has in the past. The areas where we would probably want to deploy are now much more intense in terms of the actual theaters themselves, because of the introduction of new technologies, new political groups, and also other strategic actors. Let's not forget, for example, the presence of groups like Wagner in many parts of Africa as well. Also the growing influence of China in many places. So wherever we look, the kind of 2 decades that Europe has had of relative permissibility in the world, of being able to think of wherever it wants to engage itself, that's no longer the case. So even on a very basic level, we're having to do much, much more, and the demands are becoming more intense, I would say. Now, as I said in my response to the EU-NATO question, certainly clear, and it's no secret, that the friction between Turkey, Greece and Cyprus is one of the main problems within the EU-NATO relationship, and it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. So we have to kind of live and deal with that. But I also think that now there is this opportunity also, as people are thinking about NATO and the defense of Europe, about what more else Europe should be doing in its neighborhood and further afield in the world. Because the risk is, of course, that we get completely absorbed into the defense of Europe, which is, as it's important as it is still not, I would say, the only way of looking at the world. We do need to be thinking about security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, wherever it may be. Right. So we're getting there. I would say that the compass is more of a kind of love letter to the need to do more. And we've been saying that for 2 decades, but I think there's no real choice. We have to just get on and deliver on what the compass calls for.
The European Union this year published its strategic compass, what it calls an ambitious plan of action for strengthening the EU's security and defence policy by 2030. The document shares a threat assessment of the current world and paints a particularly bleak picture for European security. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine to the east, continued conflict in Libya and Syria to the south, tensions with Turkey in the eastern Mediterranean, potentially devastating impacts of climate change within the Arctic, not to mention ongoing threats of terrorism and cyber attacks. The document also outlines several proposed policy steps which it divides into 4 pillars: act, secure, invest, and partnerships. The latter 3 mainly dealing with developing stronger intelligence capacities, increasing European defence spending, and strengthening partnerships with allies such as NATO and the UN. However, for ACT in particular, the document suggests an ambitious revitalisation of European defence, proposing a new EU rapid deployment capacity of up to 5,000 troops, reinforcing CSDP missions through a more flexible decision-making process, integrating the European Peace Facility to its fullest, and a promise to conduct live exercises as well as enhancing military mobility. What remains to be seen is how much these proposals are realised. It is not a new idea to have greater European military integration, and has been a feature of other European initiatives and treaties such as PESCO, but as is often the case, getting member states to promise something is one thing, getting them to do it is another issue altogether.
By the sounds of things, it sounds like the compass is more a wish list for European foreign policy, if that makes sense, for things that we want to accomplish and want to address. Now, the existing tools, going back to the CSDP again, and you mentioned this before about some of the missions. And one of the questions that I would have then is, when we've seen how limited the existing tools have been operationally, how will we then even pretend to project a global presence? For example, there is, by one reading, only one true military operation the CSDP is currently doing, and that's in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There are 2 naval missions for Libya and Somalia, but beyond training missions, that's pretty much it. So I guess if this is all we've got, how can we build on this? And let's not dispense with this experiences that we have from these existing missions, but what lessons can we learn from them as well? Because, for example, in Libya, Irini, there have been a lot of criticisms that even this mission doesn't meet its own basic objectives, and its basic objectives is to enforce an arms embargo. So I don't know if you follow all of that, but it's more how do we go from here based on this existing experience to a global presence?
Yeah. It's a core challenge. I think also that the compass kind of recognizes that. And I think if you were to ask senior policymakers in the EU, they'd also say the same thing, especially those working on the missions themselves, the missions and operations themselves, where in many cases the struggle has been a commitment by member states even to supply and make ready basic capabilities. And that can be both civilian and military. So there is a long way to go in this. And if you look at the longer term historical trend of CSDP, actually most of our ambitious military missions happened at the beginning of the policy and not now. We have many more civilian missions, and the military mission operations and missions that you rightfully said are pretty much at the lower end of the scale, except for, of course, EUFOR. Now, there is an ambition there as well in the compass to make sure that we don't continue on that road, because the risk is now, of course, that as more military resources are diverted, or not diverted, but are channeled into responding to Ukraine and Russia's aggression, the risk is that we will have less bandwidth then for crisis management in the close vicinity of the region, and even, I would say, further than that, force projection or political projection into places like the Indo-Pacific. We're just not able to do that now, even though the political ambition is there. Now, this is also hinges on, I think, a much deeper question about the relevance of crisis management. Because I think if you look at the experiences of Mali, the Sahel, if you Afghanistan, I think a lot of people are scratching their heads and saying, well, the game, the state building game is very passé now. And there is a certain kind of logic to that and truth to that, given that most politicians and most governments are now focusing on a different paradigm, the one of strategic competition, and in particular with the rise of China and the threat from Russia. So how do you kind of inject meaning or a rationale for continued crisis management operations and missions? And the truth is that there are a lot of governments who just don't see any interest in crisis management. Now, I would say that for the US, for example, there's a different logic there. I mean, they're kind of protected by two giant oceans, so that helps them to some degree. But I think for Europeans, the geographical proximity that we have to places like North Africa, Sahel, and other places where there is instability, the question is, well, can you really forego crisis management as a paradigm? I think what's changing is that we are slowly getting rid of the, if I can put it this way, the 1990s version of crisis management, which is basically seeing EU engagement as a kind of form of social policy around the world. And it's still not ready. It's still not fully articulated, I would say. But there is now a movement towards thinking about crisis management in terms of how does potential deployment to a crisis situation, how does that fit in with the broader geopolitical problems that we see? So as I mentioned already with Wagner Group, we don't know in the future also what China's interests around the world will be. Europe could quickly find itself in a situation where it's involved in countries and has its interests involved in countries, and that it has to engage in I would say, a different paradigm than it's been used to in the past. And also because the demands of government from around the world are very different today than they were in the past as well. So there isn't a kind of, I would say, paradigm shift when it comes to crisis management that is not quite there yet, but is slowly becoming articulated. Within the compass in particular, you'll see one of the deliverables or one of the projects that the EU wants to develop is the so-called rapid deployment capacity. And that tool is really about having a kind of rapid reaction force. I think the figures are between 5,000 and 6,000 that the EU should be able to deploy at relatively rapid pace to crisis situations around the world. Now, we already saw in Afghanistan that it took about 5,000 troops to secure Bagram Airport for evacuation. So just for a rescue and evacuation operation, that's the number of troops that you need plus enablers. And Europe couldn't even do that alone, right? So that's the basic level, I think, that the EU wants to get at. But the rapid deployment capacity idea is a bit broader than that, right? So it's about the force itself, but it's also about addressing all of those obstacles to the deployment of force in the past. So we've already had in the EU battle groups, coalitions of the willing, and it's not always been easy to deploy them. So I think one of the things that Compass is trying to do is first address the reasons why it's been difficult to deploy them, and then try to bring in kind of remedies. So just one example is one of common funding. In the past, it was very clear that a lot of member states were maybe willing to participate in military operations, but then said, well, if we've got to bear the cost of on our own, then this doesn't really look, very exciting or attractive to us. So what can you do at the EU level then to improve common funding? I mean, that's a core question. There are other ones as related to political decision making. You know that CSDP and the EU security and defense policy is governed by unanimity, so all member states have to agree. So now there is a step using the treaties that allow for this to see if we can't have coalitions of the willing, maybe, when it comes to decision making. So it might make the idea of deploying force within a group of member states rather than at the EU 27 level. It might make it much easier, although it's a sensitive area to go into. So I think that gives you a flavor maybe of at least identifying some of the problems and then trying to remedy them.
At this point, I guess the final general questions would be, what can we expect moving forward? Now, you've mentioned a few things so far about how the conception of EU foreign policy has changed from, say, a more 90s approach to today. You mentioned these new tools like the rapid deployment capacity that you were talking about here, but what can we see? What do you think is plausible moving forward? I mean, the media, it seems to be obsessed with this talk about a European army. Now, beyond that, there are other mechanisms that some EU member states have been using to, say, circumvent a more broader European policy, but within the framework. So things like, I'm thinking of things like PESCO, for example, as a sort of a tool to concretize cooperation between willing member states. Now, do you think that moving forward we'll see more of these types of actions in order to have a more responsive European policy, or do you think Europe will continue to be, well, slow to react, as it has appeared to have been the past decade at least?
I think that when it comes to the operational dimension of EU engagement, there we will still have big political sensitivities. So I think it's good that the EU itself plans for the types of missions and operations it wants to deploy, gets in place the enablers and capabilities it needs for that. But ultimately, any decision to deploy force or use force is a very sensitive political one. So all you can really do as an organization is prepare for it and then wait for political leaders to take a decision. The worst situation you could find yourself in is that the political masters take a decision and you don't have the capabilities or you're not prepared for it. So I think in the operational side of things, that is the direction of traffic at the moment. What is really interesting about the EU, and I think you mentioned this with PESCO, but I would also add to that the European Defence Fund, is that the EU is moving much faster, I would say, and probably with a bit more ambition when it comes to the defence industrial and capability dimension, which is another big important part of what the EU is doing, and also sets itself apart from, I think, NATO, which, although it has its own cooperative frameworks as well in investing in capabilities, I think it's the EU that really has the financial firepower and structure to allow that. Now, PESCO is one area where, of course, member states in an intergovernmental sense, so just between themselves, are trying to develop capabilities. But then in the European Defence Fund, you have the role of the Commission, which has itself become a very important actor in European defence. And the Commission is able then to use money from the EU budget, which itself is kind of breaking a long-standing taboo of using that money to invest in military capabilities and defense research. So if you were to ask me, I would consider that to be the main area where we would see the EU moving much faster in terms of its security and defense. And by the way, that's I would say it's quite positive in the sense that, you know, the capabilities that are developed by EU27, they're not exclusively for use in the EU. They're owned by member states, even though they've been cooperating for the EU. So I think it has a positive payoff for NATO as well, in terms of the capabilities that NATO needs. And if you look at the European Defence Fund and PESCO, you start seeing capabilities which you probably say, well, you wouldn't really need them for crisis management, operations and missions, but you probably would need them for European defence. So things like, you know, investing in technologies related to unmanned armoured vehicles or main battle tanks, possibly even investing in the future combat aircraft system. All of these capabilities are more suited to NATO and deterrence rather than crisis management, right? So it tells you also a little bit of a story of where member states and where the EU is also going in that direction. So I think defence industry capability development is a really important part of what the EU is doing, and maybe not as a footnote, but as a kind of taster of what's to come as well. You and the listeners might be aware of the fact that the next stage in this discussion of defense industrial cooperation, and as a direct result of the war on Ukraine, is now the EU moving into the idea of common defense procurement, right? So using EU resources to be able to fund and finance things like ammunition, munitions for, of course, the war effort, and also to replenish the stocks of European militaries themselves. Longer term, so that should be over the next 5 or so years, the EU hopes to have a fully fledged common defense procurement program, which should then move from ammunition and munitions into the more serious dimension, I would say, of jointly procuring and developing things like future air systems, main battle tanks, whatever it may be. So it's quite I would say, rapid, but also really important development in the EU side. And the member states seem to be biting, the hand off of the Commission in that sense.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we'll leave it there for today. But again, thank you for joining me for this discussion. I think it was very enlightening. Of course, European foreign policy is extremely broad, and we've only been able to really touch the waters of how deep and detailed all these different things are, all these different policies, all these different mechanisms, and of course, the strategic threats that are currently happening. But regardless, I think this was a great overview for anybody listening. So at this point, I'll say thank you. And to all of our listeners, thank you for listening again, and join another episode of the MENA Talks podcast very soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.